Hello, everyone, and welcome to yet another discussion with me and my guests. I have today Luisa Godinez Pooch and Inderjeet Rupra. Missing is Jitendra Kedan, and they together wrote a paper entitled Ethnic Cleavages and Vote Choice in Trinidad and Tobago. Very moving, if not heartbreaking, paper. And I just thought it was important to bring this paper to light and to have this discussion so that more people can read and see it and understand what the findings of this paper were. First of all, let me congratulate you, Luisa and Inderjeet, on writing this paper, and of course, Jitendra, who couldn't be with us today. I really appreciate the work that you've done and focusing on this issue, this very important issue for Trinidad and Tobago. So I'll just get straight into the questions that I had for you after reading this paper and shedding some tears. The first thing is that I always thought that most people in Trinidad, in particular, less so in Tobago, are actually ethnically mixed. And that's certainly the case amongst most of my friends and some of my family, even though perhaps most people might identify with one ethnicity or another, even if they are in fact mixed. Is this something you can comment on based on the research that you did for this paper?
Sure. Can I start?
Absolutely.
First of all, let me thank you for inviting us to chat with you and your audience. It's a real pleasure to be here. You're completely right. You know, individuals possess multiple ethnic identities whose salience changes according to space and time. And therefore, societies and families may have multiple cleavages due to their identities. But here we are using data where the individual is asked what is his race. And they're given options of African origin, Indian, white, Syrian, Chinese, etc., and mixed of those categories. So this is a self-identified ethnic identity.
Also, I want to say thank you so much for having us here presenting these results, which we also found very interesting. And I do think that this is a great question to start this conversation, and one that we obviously thought about a lot as we were writing this paper. And as Inder was mentioning, here we're using the LAPUP survey, which is a public opinion survey. So all the data that we use really reflects opinion and self-assessment from participants, right? I do want to add just a little extra thing, which is that for our paper, we defined ethnicity into three main categories. First, participants of African heritage, those with Indian heritage, and those that self-assessed as mixed. And so we constructed our study this way because we were very interested in teasing out the role of the two main ethnicities in Trinidad and Tobago, but also because the data in terms of other ethnicities and races was insufficient in terms of quantity to lead to rigorous analysis. So given all of this, it is possible that participants may have identified into one specific ethnicity, even though they may have some traces of other races or ethnicities.
Okay, gotcha. Thanks for that important explanation. And in reading the paper, you know, of course, the main finding of your paper, which is why I said it was heartbreaking, was that ethnicity was found to be the primary determinant of voters' choice in Trinidad and Tobago. And this, despite even education. So I just want to ask very broadly of both of you, if you could explain to me what motivated your work, and in summary, how did you arrive at this finding that ethnicity is the primary determinant of voters' choice in Trinidad and Tobago, which is not surprising, but yet still it's at this, 2022, it's still heartbreaking, shocking, disappointing on so many levels as a Trinidadian. But tell me what motivated you and how did you arrive briefly at this finding?
If I may. So actually, it all started with a very obscure, technical and boring article Jeet and I wrote on the role of the real exchange rate in diversification policy. The reaction to that article was totally dedicated to the race of the authors, as if the legitimacy of the arguments were derived from the racial identity of the authors. I can't repeat some of the comments on this meeting, but
people from my country, oh God, I'm so sorry.
So Jeet and I started wondering about to what extent does race play a role in the country's development, political, economic, or social. Given that we know, both Jeet and I knew very little about this topic, we obviously turned to Louisa, Dr. Louisa, who's a specialist in political science.
That's right. In my work, I focus on studying politics from a race and ethnicity lens. So when Inder and Jeet approached me with this idea, I was just very interested to jump into the project because it was an opportunity for me to branch out into my type of research, but in a different context. And if I may say something about the findings, you are right. The findings were not necessarily surprising, but they were interesting in a number of ways, right? First, they did inform previous work from the general literature on ethnic voting that say and suggest that the role of ethnicity was declining or is declining in other contexts. On the other hand, this was a really interesting opportunity for us to prove empirically what many anecdotal literature was saying about the importance of ethnicity in the Twin Islands. And I want to end with like a more positive note, saying that even though we did find that ethnicity was the main factor associated with voting, we did find some other factors that played a smaller role in voting. And we did study for this paper the 2010 election, meaning that it's been a number of years, and perhaps perhaps these trends have changed somewhat in the last years.
Yes, and we will get into some of those in the later questions. But the question I have now, so we know that you found that ethnicity is a major determinant in voting behavior. And that type of behavior, ethnic voting, according to your paper, has been associated with low democratic stability and poor economic performance. And I have to say that this is Trinidad and Tobago, poor economic performance. Of course, some people ascribe it to the Dutch disease paradox of plenty and so on. But this is yet another explanatory factor. Or is it? Can you tell us whether this is an association only, or is there any causation between ethnic voting and poor economic performance, or do you not have that that robustness yet to be able to make that causal link between the two?
Well, can I start, Lisa? You're right. There's enormous literature which suggests that oil-producing economies will do poorly regarding economic growth and economic performance in general. There's also another strand of literature which looks at ethnic diversity and economic performance and conclude in general that the economic and political performance will be poor relative to non-ethnically diverse economies. And there is a beginning literature, although much smaller given that it's a smaller sample of countries, where ethnic diversity and political and economic dependence on oil reinforce each other through institutions and political processes, the negative impacts of both these characteristics. Now, the question about causality, as you very well know, you can only answer that definitely with an experimental design. And these issues is really looking at correlation and plausible arguments surrounding the results. So causality, perhaps we can't prove from a strict econometric point of view, but correlation certainly and plausible arguments surrounding those give us that conclusion.
I think I am more versed in sort of the first part of your question about democratic stability and ethnic voting. So I will say something about that. And, you know, there is a large literature that says that ethnic voting is prevalent in many democracies. A large body of work has documented that voters around the world are more likely to vote for co-ethnic candidates. Of course, the degree to which ethnicity matters in elections varies a lot from context to context. But the reason why ethnic voting really occurs is that ethnicity functions as a shortcut, if you will, for other types of features from a candidate or other types of information about the political agenda of that candidate. So the idea is that in places where there is less access to this type of information, or where access is harder to achieve, voters tend to turn to ethnicity when electing their representatives. And in contrast, in areas where there is more access to this type of information, then voters, even though they may use co-ethnicity as well, they also turn to other types of information when making when choosing their representatives. And this has been linked in you know, the body of work that already exists to low democratic stability, because generally there is less access to information in low democratic countries where there's less perhaps accountability or less prospects for democratic consolidation. And again, as Inder already mentioned, in terms of causation versus correlation, it's the same here in terms of democratic stability and ethnic voting. It's really hard to make causal inference based on surveys, even though the surveys are really good and useful instruments to prove a correlation between various variables or factors, if you will.
I can
Yes.
add.
Sorry, go ahead, Indrajit.
We also tested alternative hypotheses, for example, education, political knowledge of the individual to the extent he reads newspapers, etc. And these were found to be insignificant. So the heuristic of using race is maintained despite testing the alternative hypotheses that we sometimes may discuss in an informal setting.
Yeah, that part made me cringe. That even when you tested for level of education and knowledge, that yeah, that was an insignificant factor. And to me, the underperformance in terms of social democratic stability and economic performance makes sense when you consider that your results showed that issues such as crime and corruption, for example, are statistically insignificant in explaining voters' decisions, because then it means that the voting is irrespective of those issues. And if you're not voting on those issues, well, then you're voting for the status quo and for however things are the way they are, and not voting for things to improve. So my next question is around that issue where you said the results show that national issues such as crime and corruption are statistically insignificant in explaining voters' decisions. Voters that receive a food card from the government are more likely to vote for the incumbent party, that is the PNM, rather than the UNC, by about 5 to 6%. Voters working in the public sector are also about 5% more likely to vote for the PNM than the UNC. And this tells me that the majority of the electorate do not care about the issues. They care more about jobs, about job security, handouts, and they associate that type of benefit more with the PNM than with the UNC because the PNM has been in power for about 80% of the post-independence period. You went on to say that we find that ethnic voting is rewarded politically as it increases the probability of voters for finding public employment when their party wins. This is not trivial as public employment has averaged 30% of total employment for the period 1999 to 2014. This is really, really difficult, was difficult and still is difficult for me to swallow because I feel like, how do we get out of this if people are voting not based on issues, only based on ethnicity, and they're voting so that they can, or at least in their minds, have job security, have food cards and other benefits. What are your thoughts on this? And if you have any hope to offer as to how we might get out of this, I would love to hear from you on that.
There's two parts to your question. One is the statistical irrelevance of crime and corruption, which are two enormous issues in Trinidad. And corruption in particular raises its head during elections, where accusations of embezzlement and etc. dominate the news, as does crime, both which also have racial overtones. The second part of the question is it rational for voters to vote for their ethnic party? I don't find it necessarily bad that people are looking out for themselves and their families in terms of employment. Not only is public employment 30% and therefore an important variable, but also wages in the public sector are generally, for equivalent jobs in the private sector, much higher. So getting a job in the public sector is a rational thing to do. Mm-hmm. And what we found over three governments, PNM, UNC, etc., that yes, the political party in power pays off its electorate at its base by giving them jobs. So when there's a uptake in oil revenue, facilitating that increase in employment, African government, PNM government, will in the majority hire black Canadians and Canadians. And the opposite is true for UNC. When oil revenue declines, who gets hit hardest is the opposite ethnic group to the political party in power. So this actually makes sense in the sense of an individual looking out for his and her interests. So I'm not sure that it's necessarily a very negative finding. The issue of corruption and crime this was a particular issue in the 2010 election. Both the electoral platforms adopted by PNM and UNC. So this was a surprising result.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think that this specific finding was especially interesting because 62% of participants identified crime as the most serious problem, and up to 12% of the people that we spoke to also identified corruption as the major challenge facing the country. And even then, as you mentioned, Marla, participants in the survey didn't consider crime or corruption when making electoral decisions. And in contrast, as you mentioned, voters that did receive a food card from the government and those that worked in the public sector were more likely to vote for the incumbent party. But as Inder was saying, this is because they perceived a direct benefit from the party in power, and it makes total sense that this would be the way they would react. But I think what is most important here also is to take all of these conclusions with a pinch of salt. And the reason is that we were only able here to study the 2010 election, right? And I go back to this point because I think it is an important one. So what really would be interesting would be to expand this study to the 2020 general election. Of course, this is extremely challenging. First, because the LAPUP survey, the survey we used for this paper, has not been repeated after 2014. And on the other hand, there aren't other publicly available data sources that look at ethnicity and voting behavior for the 2020 general election. So hopefully this paper can function as a way to push or incentivize more instruments of this kind, where we can actually go ahead and study whether these conclusions that we reached for the 2010 can be translated into more recent elections. And now I'm sure, critics may think, well, what's the point of studying the 2010 election then? And there I would also like to say something. I think the 2010 general election was a very interesting election to study for a number of reasons. First, it was the first time in a long time that a coalition of multi-ethnic based political parties contested and won an election. So that for itself is really important. And this was led by the UNC, right, of Indian origin. On the other hand, it was a moment where there, like Inder mentioned, there was a high and rising level of crime and corruption that people identified. So we were able to actually tease these factors in our study. And it was also a time when the country was facing a challenging economic environment because it was recovering from the global financial crisis. And finally, but not least, it was also the first time that the population was able to elect a female prime minister of Indian origin, right? So the whole context of the 2010 general election provided a unique opportunity for us to test various factors associated with voting behavior, even though I reiterate that it would be really interesting to replicate this in more recent elections as well.
In 2015 as well, in particular. I think that in 2010 really was special. We have an expression in Trinidad and Tobago that we don't vote people in, we vote them out. And and when the turnout is high, that's generally when you have a change. And it's when people come out because they're angry and they want to get rid of the incumbent and they want to make sure that they get rid of the incumbent. But yes, the fact that we had an opportunity to elect our first female prime minister, that I think people wanted change in 2010. I think that was really the moment in time where people really wanted change. But unfortunately, that's not what we got. And here we are still in 2022. And that leads me to my final question, which, so many sensitivities around ethnicity and the way we discuss it in this paper, given the data. And in your paper, you say that you find that Indian origin voters that identify corruption as the most critical problem in the country are 23.4% more likely to vote for the PNM. They didn't come out in 2010, maybe, I don't know. And Indian origin voters receiving food cards and identifying corruption as a central issue are more likely to vote for the PNM when there is a new UNC-led coalition. You also found that mixed ethnic voters that view crime as a significant problem are 9.4% more likely to vote for the UNC than the PNM. And mixed ethnic voters that identify crime as an issue, not employed with the government, and are center left-leaning are associated with voting for the UNC coalition. And I find this very interesting because it suggests that among Indian voters who have a bias, as your paper found, have a bias towards voting for the UNC in general, those that see corruption as the biggest problem are, however, more likely to vote for the PNM maybe because they see the UNC as more corrupt. So that's my first question. And is that a fair conclusion to draw? And secondly, mixed ethnic voters see the UNC as less corrupt than the PNM. So if you could just discuss that a little bit for me. Thank you.
Yeah, first of all, we have to keep in mind that we are talking about a very small, relatively small group of cross-party voters, ethnic party voters. So yes, that's what the statistical evidence suggests. But again, generalizing it should be treated with caution. I mean, after all, we are treating this data, which is limited to 2010 elections. So those are the two caveats I would keep in mind before one generalizes, as you have done for society and elections repeated over time.
Yeah,
Okay.
and if I were to add something to that, so we did find a small portion, as Inder mentioned, of voters that did not vote based on ethnicity, right? And so we were very curious to know a little bit more about them. So we actually divided our sample to analyze non-ethnic voters, right? And so that what it means is that we looked at the preferences of African origin voters that voted for the UNC, the preferences of Indian origin voters that voted for the PNM, and mixed ethnic voters that voted for the UNC. Because in our sample, we found that mixed ethnic voters tended to vote generally for the PNM. So, right? So we separated our samples into 3 subsamples representing each of these ethnic groups. And as you can imagine, these samples were very small given all of these divisions that we had to do. And so in this subsample, we did find that a smaller share of voters compared to the whole sample of participants in the survey didn't rely on ethnicity when electing candidates. They relied on other factors such as their ideologies, education levels, social benefits, and wealth. So this gives a little hope and a little optimism to our results, but it is a very preliminary sort of finding, if you will, and one that really presses the importance of and analyzing the most recent elections to see whether this finding has actually expanded in more recent times, if you will.
Yeah, going back when we first started looking at them, we said, who are these people? And our first, when you start looking at data, the first result was we couldn't tell. There was no substantial difference in education, all the other variables between these cross-race voters and traditional voters. And it was refined and refined with the caution that we're talking about very small sample, and therefore the power of statistical analysis is somewhat limited. But it's a curiosity. Why do people?
It is. It is, and on the issue of hope, because that's one thing that that was damaged for me when I read your paper, was that I felt like, how do we get out of this as a country where we're not focused on the issues, we're only focused on, voting for a party where the people look like me, look like who I am, whoever we are, and how we identify ourselves ethnically, and therefore, how do we get out of the economic underperformance that goes with that, as you also mentioned in your paper? Do you have let me just add to that the fact that, as we discussed earlier, Inderjeet, that we're seeing younger people also exhibiting this bias for ethnic-based voting, whereas I would have thought that the younger generation would have been much less concerned about that and much more interested in the issues, right? How do we get out of this? How do we, as a people, are there examples in history of other countries that have evolved to a point where people are largely undecided, not wedded to a particular party based on ethnicity or historical factors. How do you get out of this?
Well, that's a very complex question to answer, and probably the most important question to ask. You know, first one has to locate the performance of Trinidad with respect to its comparators. After all, ethnic polarization or fraternization not only leads to negative acts, but has led to civil wars, violence, etc. This has been largely avoided in Trinidad. There's been a peaceful transition, except perhaps with the Black Power movement period of governments. So the country has sought and successfully implemented mitigating institutional mechanisms to avoid the really outlandish results that could occur for both ethnic and oil exporting economies. I mean, I was thinking of Nigeria, etc. So, you know, yes, it's bad, the results, but not so bad as it could be. I think it's always good to see how well you're doing compared to the worst case scenario. Now, the best case scenario, the results are that societies can escape from these forces. And it's exactly what you are lamenting about: education, political engagement, political civic attitudes. Remember, in the democracy index by the by the Economist Intelligence Unit, what pulls down Trinidad to a flawed democracy is political culture and political participation. That means that if efforts are made to increase political participation and efforts are made to increase political culture, the negative effects of ethnicity on the country would be reduced. That may be a bit of a blah answer, but there you are.
But no, I appreciate the answer, and I think you're right. It's just how do we get there? But yes, go ahead. Sorry, go ahead, Louisa.
No. I was just going to say I agree with Inder. I mean, it's definitely not there's not a template to fixing these types of issues, right? It's a very, very deep. It would require a very deep sum of changes, most likely. But I do see areas of opportunity, and I think just to end in a happier note, if you will, I see areas of opportunity in the sense that we did find a smaller portion of the population that looked at other factors when voting. And perhaps we are also left with a curiosity in terms of identifying that people saw benefits for voting for the incumbent party when they received either a job in the government or a direct help from the government. So perhaps looking at those areas and trying to restructure the way public employment and benefits are distributed could be an area of opportunity to essentially eliminate those benefits that people identify based on ethnicity that could lead to to people using other factors when they vote. But it's certainly a very intricate question to answer, one that would require much more thinking than our paper. But I do want to end in a happier note, and I do see some areas of opportunity. And again, I don't want to sound like a broken record here, but it would be really interesting to know how much of these dynamics are actually replicated in more recent elections, because maybe this area of opportunity that we identified here is bigger than it was in 2010. So.
Well, you know, certainly the fact that you guys are writing a book that explores this issue more deeply, maybe you will get this opportunity to delve more into these issues as to how we get out of this. but also, just going on my understanding of the situation that roughly 1/3 of the electorate is supposedly undecided or less biased, if you will. I'm hoping that as time passes, as people think differently, that body of 1/3, so they say, of the electorate that is undecided, that they grow, and they certainly, I should say we, because I consider myself one of them, that we focus more on the issues as opposed to just the ethnic background of the people in the parties. And we certainly need more options. I feel like having just this binary option of, choosing between the devil and the deep blue sea, if you will, it's quite frustrating. So hopefully there will be lots of change in the political arena in the years to come that can help elevate my country and get it out of this chronic underperformance that we face, even though, as Rupert Inderjeet reminded me, that it's not as bad as other countries. But you know what? It could have been so much better as well, right? And let's hope that this work helps to shine a light as to exactly who we are, and what really is happening in our country. And so maybe people will wake up to this reality and maybe do something differently the next time around. So I thank you, Louisa. I thank you, Inderjeet, and of course, Jitendra, who's not with us, for doing this work. I thank you for spending this time with me to discuss this important work you do. And I wish you the best of luck with the book that you all are working on.
Thank you, Madeline.
It was a pleasure. Thank you for having us.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.